Welcome, everyone. My name is Abby Beneke, and it's my pleasure today to be introducing Dr. Sarah A. Robert. Before I do that, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Colonialism is an ongoing process. As a department, we recognize and respect the knowledge reflected in the Ho-Chunk's custodianship of Dejope and their continuing connection to land, water, and community at UW-Madison. We recognize the violence, displacement, and settlement that shape our relations in and with this space. And we must therefore, as a department, commit to justice, commit ourselves to addressing the intentional erasure of Indigenous peoples in our policies, practices, teaching and learning, and in our relations to place and with the earth. We encourage all members of the EPS and School of Education communities to trace, celebrate, and deepen their own connections to Dejope, and to learn about the histories and present stories of the resilient Ho-Chunk presence and relationships that shape Dejope. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah A. Robert. Dr. Robert is an international education policy expert. She critiques how policy and politics shape and are shaped by the intersectional qualities of gender in global, South American, and US urban contexts. Her ethnographies and qualitative social science-informed studies are concentrated on three areas: teachers' work, school food, and curriculum and textbooks. As a first-gen feminist interdisciplinary public intellectual, she strives to demystify policy, to cultivate and support policy protagonists through teaching and long-term community collaborations, and to transform educational decision-making into an inclusive process focused on realizing human rights and just transitions in educational institutions and for societies. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Robert.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you first and foremost to Erica Turner for suggesting me to speak here, pinching myself. And thanks to Michael Dixon for hunting me down and getting me organized. I appreciate that. And last but not least, thanks Leslie Bartlett for very last minute guidance and enthusiasm. Appreciate it. So the first thing I need to let you all know about is that I had a technical difficulty. So Michael is totally going to be in this. We're like all in this together, High School Musical style. And he's going to be moving the slides for me. So apologies for having to make that little, next slide, please. And everyone, thank you to Michael for making this happen. So without further ado, so I'm Sarah, and I, throughout this title, caring about policy protagonism. And I will say that I can thank and also blame Erica Turner for holding me to focus on policy protagonism for this talk. So yeah, but this is all my own responsibility, or whatever that disclaimer is that people put in their books. So I struggled to develop this talk, and I found myself asking the question over and over again of, what do I have to say to EPF students? And it was very humbling because I think of the folks I went to school with, and just terrifyingly smart and accomplished scholars and activists. I definitely was feeling imposter syndrome. It's real, and somehow creeps back into mind when I least expect it. So to muddle through this talk, I have actually written down my script, which is not like me either. I'm a talker, and I like to tell stories. But I found that writing things down helped me clarify not what I have to say, but what I want to say to you today. And I'll use stories that are personal and are experiences that I've had that were not necessarily research, but come from everyday life. And yet, as an ethnographer, um, these experiences are really the stuff that leads to uh, research, to funding, to publications, and last but not least, engagement in public policy processes. Change the slide. I'm going to give you a moment to read the text that accompanies this in Spanish or English. So, this amazing 3 little boxes of text and images comes from Kino, who is the creator, illustrator of this character whose name is Mafalda. And Mafalda is very famous and beloved in Argentina and in some other South American countries as well. And weirdly, in the UK, not sure how it got there. It was long after colonization. So, this comic, when I stumbled on it in my everyday life, reading comics to my kids, captures so many themes that are embedded in my research and in my academic career. Teachers and their work, the gender dimensions of teaching and of education, the context of public education itself, the national context of education in Argentina, regional differences, also the space in which education it transpires. There's also cultural practices that are embedded in these 3 little boxes, and there's also food. the Somehow food slides in here. And now I've translated, if anyone has looked back and forth, Mafalda hates soup for some reason and is fed soup a lot by her mother throughout all of the years of the comic strip. But I changed it to broccoli, trying to get some similarity and translation to English and the US context. But there it is, food. Food enters along with all of those other themes that I just talked to you about: how we feed children, whether we're going to feed children in schools, and what we're going to feed them to, who's going to do that work as well. So for me, this kind of aha moment, they're embedded in everyday life all the time. And they often do emerge from care work that I'm doing as a teacher, as a scholar, as a mother, as a care provider for family and community. But to play on the word care for just one more moment, this aha moment also comes to me from just focusing on what I care about. It symbolizes and reflects what I care about or what I give a damn about, and that is I asked. There were questions that I asked myself that led me to care about policy protagonism and care about school food in particular. Slide. Thanks. And those questions come from Mariame Kaba, a prison abolitionist and activist who tweeted years ago, questions I regularly ask myself when I'm outraged by injustice. First, what resources exist so I can better educate myself? Who's already doing the work around this injustice? Do I have the capacity to offer concrete support and help to them? And how can I be constructive if I'm going to be able to do that? So these questions to me are actually the drivers behind policy protagonism, or they could be, maybe they should be. So my goal today is to try to illustrate my approach to caring about policy protagonism. I won't go too much into detail about the concept of care, but I'm super happy to talk to you about it. I definitely have a shorter talk today because I kind of like talking to people and having a dialogue. So hoping we can have a little bit of that after I'm done. I will give a bare bones overview of policy protagonism as well. And will direct you in my talk to some of the publications where I've tried to suss that out, and also empirical studies in which I probe it in different national contexts. So I'm going to use my not so linear talk to sketch out my academic career of caring about policy protagonism. EPS, or my doc studies, was not where it all began to bring into focus policy protagonism. It didn't start in Madison. It didn't start with my studies. But as I said earlier, it started with just giving myself permission in a way to actually focus on what I cared about in my academic work. So I've been trying the last months as I thought through the talk and talks really, because I couldn't decide what to talk about. So I wrote 2 talks. But as I was preparing the talk prep and wanted to settle into that genesis story for where this policy protagonism came from, I realized there were many moments that built toward my most clear and concrete, and also most recent rendition or manifestation of caring about policy protagonism, which is is the framework really for my newest book, actually a slide, which is called Transforming School Food Politics Around the World. It came out in May, and it's a collaboration, a 4-year-long collaboration with Dr. Jennifer Gaddis at UW. Check her out, she's amazing. But try to keep up with her. She doesn't sit still. So in this collection, we have school food stakeholders who are giving a damn about who feeds whom what, how, and for what purpose, and around the world. And I want to give credit here to another EPS alum who also graduated with me in 2008, and that's Jen Sandler of the University of Massachusetts Amherst currently. And slide change, because she's the one that coined that question that I just read: who feeds whom, what, how, and for what purpose? And she contributed that along with this incredibly, as Jen always is, astute critique of new national school food policy in the United States. And she was specifically looking at the politics around breakfast clubs and the Black Panthers Breakfast Club in particular. So check it out. It's great, great chapter. So she contributed that to this first book, School Food Politics. So that book launched this kind of subfield that is interdisciplinary. It's kind of a subfield within food policies. It's a subfield within school food studies. It's a subfield within ed policy studies as well. And within that, the work around school food politics is doing something that I guess I didn't realize hadn't been done before. And it was juxtaposing the seemingly benign act of feeding kids and the struggles for finite material and symbolic resources that such an act entails, as well as the gendered implications of that work, the gendered labor that goes into that work, and the value assigned to that work and to school food in the first place. So Jen Gaddis and I revisit that first book, School Food Politics, this one, in Transforming School Food Politics, this new one. Slide, please. And in this book, we bring into view the gender dimensions of feeding children in schools, as well as at home, around the world. And we do that alongside cases that show how diverse groups of stakeholders have engaged in and with governing bodies at multiple scales to transform school food systems. So, talking about school food politics, somewhat begs a question, especially because this is an EPS talk, like, so why school food? Where does that come into all this EPS stuff? And the other question is, what does this have to do with EPS studies? I've answered the first question, why school food, in multiple studies that I have published. sometimes I'm sharing stories of my own lunch experience in public schools in the United States and of the role of food and commensality, eating collectively and together, and of foodscapes that is woven through my life experience and my experience as a grad student as well. One example that I just wanted to give a shout out to, in which I'm talking about food and food ways, um, is in a couple conceptualizations that I developed around the abuelita's epistemology. Um, in those study, in that conceptual framework, and to support the development of that conceptual framework, I found myself leaning on my grandmother's food ways, what they taught me about food, and what that meant in terms of building community and also engaging with public services in order to nourish communities. I produced that work with a collective, a diverse collective of mother scholars during the pandemic. And our goal was to reconceptualize academic work during that strange time that was COVID into terms that were and are more humane. And for me, that kind of began with thinking about food and the way that I was nourishing my family during the pandemic. But two other examples that come from my doctoral studies time and that stand out as catalysts for my interdisciplinary research into school food politics and policies is, and if you can change the slide, thanks, is related to my work as a mom during my doctoral study. So this is my oldest daughter, Julia, who's not this, she's much older now than this. But I began my doctoral studies at EPS when Juli was 2 months old, and I definitely remember. And when I run into fellow EPSers during that time, the two things they remember is Sarah always breastfeeding and Sarah having this fabulous pair of red shoes. I like both of those, okay, and to be remembered for both of those. So I arrived in Madison from Buenos Aires with Juli, and over the years of completing my PhD, she began her education at Ben Franklin Elementary School in the city. And as a grad student family, at the time I was at UW as a grad assistant, I made $9,000 a year. And so our family of three made it work on 9,000, and then found ways to make some more money and found ways to share food money, and definitely took advantage of public services such as WIC. And when she started school, we also wanted to take advantage of school food lunches. We knew we were eligible for free, probably reduced lunches. We were eligible for reduced lunches. I mean, free lunches. So Hootie went to school and we sent her off without a lunchbox. And yet, as we started processing her school experience, we realized that there was something amiss with lunch, which is, for little kids, I mean, even for big kids, lunch is fun. At least it should be. It's where you meet with your friends. It's where you get to socialize. It's where you get to eat because you're probably hungry because you had gym class in the morning or you had recess. But it wasn't a joyful experience for Huhu. And we learned that it was because she has a longer name. She also we speak Spanish at home, so she has the name Julia, but she understood herself to be Julia, and she had to say her name to get her free lunch. And the worker just didn't understand what she was saying, and so gave her a hard time and made it very difficult for her to actually get her lunch. She's 5, to get her lunch and go sit down and be with her friends. And so she kind of stopped eating. And then when she did get the lunch, she talked about how it just tasted strange or different. She talked about how sometimes the strawberries were frozen. So nothing that she was being provided was warm or fresh. Um, Yet that cost was right for us. But in the end, I needed my kid to eat, and I needed her to get through her day and get through her day in a little bit more happy and positive way. And so we took on the cost of making a lunch for her. And we also bought her that Clifford lunchbox that you see there. But during my time in EPS doctoral studies, I also was traveling back and forth to Buenos Aires, where I was conducting a long-term ethnography with teachers in metropolitan Buenos Aires. And when we enrolled her in school there, we had a very different experience. And that experience was, first and foremost, that her school day wasn't a whole day. The schools didn't provide lunch. She went to school for what was called turno mañana. So she just went for the morning. We picked her up at midday, and then you eat at home. And so you can see here, and for some reason it's in a takeout. It's not even takeout. I don't know why it's in a takeout container, but she's eating gnocchis at home after a day of school in Buenos Aires. So here we begin to process as a family and begin to navigate and to engage with policies around school food and how we feed kids in schools from this very early age. And at the same time that I'm going through my doctoral studies. And while I'm in Buenos Aires, in addition to these personal experiences in which I'm not engaging with any governing body to change how, who feeds whom, what, how, except to just feed my own kid. But while I'm there and I'm following teachers all over the place and spending days in their high schools, the teachers start talking about the role of food in their high school work, and specifically about hunger and the lack of food access for their students. And that specifically was strange for me because I was doing research with them about curriculum. I was doing research focused on neoliberal education reform. And I knew that Argentina had a 100-year-old school food policy in place. But what the teachers taught me, because I was listening to them and I was following them around and learning from their students and learning from the families that went to their schools, is that the way the policy was laid out was somewhat like hunger ended at elementary school. So there was no food provided for high school students. Hunger seemed to stop with the end of elementary school. Still, the teachers struggled to do their job, which was not to feed their students or even care for them. These are high school students, they're high school teachers. They're supposed to be teaching content, not caring for students. And yet they had to resolve this problem because many instances of how hunger affects students when they're at school started to affect their ability to educate the students. They didn't come because they were hungry. They didn't come because they hadn't eaten for days. They passed out during morning assembly. And that led the teachers to become policy protagonists, specifically around issues of school food and school food policies. They, on the short term, began to do research and learn what was affecting the school community that they worked in. They pooled their own money, as often teachers do, out-of-pocket expenses going to care for and to ensure that our public school students are cared for and that public education carries on. They also sketched out a longer-term plan. And that longer-term plan meant they needed a kitchen and they needed resources at their high school so that they could feed their students a universal, everyone gets it, free of charge, no questions asked, lunch or snack. Slide, please. They also told me of how families would come to school seeking support. And this is how they already had inroads with the school community. The families came to the school seeking support in dire financial straits. Schools, as the director told me and pointed out, schools in these communities were the last remnant or bastion of the state, capital S, that the families could actually see. It was the only tangible element of the state left, the only one they could engage with and seek support that they thought the state should be responsible for caring for members of the Argentinian society. In the end, those teachers made it an incredible win. They changed policies for their school and for the region where they were teaching. They had a kitchen built, they had someone hired from the community part-time, and they had regular deliveries of meager, but at least a food, a meal that was provided to all their students free of charge. No questions asked. So next slide. So this I came to articulate as policy protagonism. And their effort was successful too, though that's not always the case, of course. So policy protagonism, as I've come to see it over the last, I guess, 20 years, includes involves four aspects, four facets toward action, which I've put up here with some examples. I want to just say the examples underneath all of the four elements of policy protagonism are all drawn from transforming school food policies. I realize the slide seemed to might make it confusing. The examples are from transforming school food policy. I first articulated policy protagonism in that dissertation book that was on the last slide and in this article when I tried to apply the concept to policy protagonism that I saw happening in the United States. So the first element that I understood to be an incredibly powerful part of policy protagonism was that stakeholders in schools define the policy problem. They aren't being given policy and the problems defined for them. They are sitting down and determining, as only they know, or as they can know best, what their school community needs resolved. In School Food Politics, the first book that I wrote that included or focused on school food, I wrote a chapter with, it was the most challenging methodological chapter and epistemological chapter thing I've ever written in my career. It's because I wrote it with a pediatrician who also worked for the public health department in Buenos Aires and who was visiting schools. And I went to her and I said, hey, you need to know about what these teachers are seeing. This will help inform your analysis of school meal programs. And when I shared the data with her, she said, that's wrong. The teachers are wrong. The problem isn't undernourishment or nutrition. It's malnutrition. It's that they must not be eating quality foods or they have tons of calories, but not, they're eating junk food, basically. This, of course, led to many fantastic discussions and led to a chapter being produced in which we're sussing out this idea of what it means for communities to define the problems that public policy should be addressing. The second item or facet of this concept that I found or articulated to date is identifying and seeking out where the power, where the resources are to address that policy-worthy problem. And in this case, an example to take a look at is the article I have cited at the bottom. And in that, I'm looking at the ways that US-based teachers are engaging with the public through social media, with digital media, in order to share their knowledge of what the problems in their public schools and their school communities is that they think policymakers should pay attention to and what school communities should mobilize around. Third is that these groups will use social categories and symbolic identities strategically. So again, thinking back to that Mafalda comic strip that I shared at the beginning, where the teacher talks about, when you're at school, I am your second mother. This is a very common phrase in identity or label for teachers in Argentina, and particularly at younger levels. But the teachers, the high school teachers in the high schools where I was at who were engaging in school food politics, they used that identity of second mothers, even though they were high school history teachers, in order to demand the resources that they needed, the kitchen and the food and the workers. How did they do that? They went to governing bodies and they said, you expect us to care for children at school, but you do not provide us with the resources to do so. Therefore, you are putting us in a position where we cannot fulfill our role and responsibility as history teacher and second mother to Argentinian youth. And finally, none of this is done in all the cases that I've seen where someone is seeking out hero or leader to follow, but rather there is, like Shirley Chisholm says, bringing your own, if there's no seat at the policymaking table, then bring your own folding chair. And by the way, while you're at it, bring a couple, because we're going together. We are going to collectively demand the change that we seek for our school community. So, and for those, I would say definitely in the Transforming School Food Politics book, there's a great article from a Canadian coalition that has just won to a certain extent, or it's, you know, Trudeau's Hail Mary to stay in office, but a national school food program will be rolled out in Canada over the next 5-10 years, unless a new government comes in and ditches it all. But the other examples you might turn to are the Brazilian chapters in Transforming School Food Politics, in which there are incredible activists who are part of Semteja in Brazil, who are explaining how they engage in policy protagonism and demand decision-making seats. So I've come to conceptualize how stakeholders change public policy, and I've theorized school food policy and politics. And I suggest this concept is applicable to diverse contexts, the US, Argentina, globally, but also different issues. It's also of interest to activists and education stakeholders who just care about who feeds whom, what, how, and why, or just more generally, care about changing public education. I try to be a part of change too, but I am an academic. I have tried to change policy too, and be engaged in education politics and in policy protagonism, specifically with Buffalo Public Schools. Slide change? Can you change this slide, please? Thanks. Awesome. So Buffalo Public Schools, that's my local level. I've engaged recurringly. I've aimed to write from a non-academic audience. I have talked to local groups to both learn about policy on the ground, to learn about the policy enactment in Buffalo Public Schools. And I've also mapped out school food for community groups who are trying to change dramatically the nature and quality of the school meal program here in our city, and to elevate at what's nearest to my heart, and I would say what I've had the most impact in Buffalo on, is to elevate food education, which is why I have that here on this slide. And specifically wanted to give a shout out to this facet of school food and school food politics, which really should include food education as well. That is how we can educate students and their families through school gardens across the city, and how we're doing that here. And doing so, highlighting the value that a quality, fresh, scratch-cooked meal and growing food in a schoolyard has to nourishing bellies, because we have school gardens that are actually leaned on heavily by our refugee population. We are a refugee resettlement city. And also it nourishes ongoing learning of food practices and culturally relevant ways of eating and growing food too. So what I've been kind of bopping all over the place. Right now we're at the local level, very local, at least for me. And that's a pretty common element of the work that I do as an education policy scholar. That is that I will zoom in on local, and then I will zoom out to larger power dynamics. So for example, we really can't understand the nature of Buffalo Public School food systems unless we zoom out to the national level and understand what the policy constraints are, what the funding structures are, and also what the global policy and politics are around answering that question, the answers to who feeds whom, what, how, and for what purpose. And while doing this zooming in and out, what I found actually really productive and very important is maintaining a focus on understanding intersectional dynamics that shape and are shaped by these global to local linkages. In the past year, for example, though Jen and I have written about localities and US context, we've also had the UN notice our work and notice our expertise and ask us to come in. Oh, I should have said slide. So the UN Women actually called on Jen and I in order to shape their climate change reports for one of the COP28 conference, and are citing our work in the reports that specifically are concerned about elevating the profile of care work and the knowledge of women, and in particular, Indigenous and minoritized populations of women around the world as the transformative agents and the key stakeholders that can help us understand how to address climate change and transform food systems. Okay. Yeah. Ah, thank you. So how is everyone doing? I'm like this but we're almost there. We're almost at the end, but I put that in there for a break. But I also wanted to use this slide as a pause because I'm talking, and I just dove headfirst into explaining to you one facet of my research, transforming school food politics, understanding policy, protagonism. And so I thought, okay, I'm talking to people from EPS, colleagues who are involved in supporting students towards their educational and career dreams. And I didn't really talk much at all or tell you from whence all of this came. So I wanted to pull a little bit back from caring about policy protagonism because it's important to me that I also share with you the foundation from which all of this, well, the foundation on which all of that sits in very general terms. So we can change the slide. Cool. All right, so nuts and bolts. When someone asks me my elevator pitch, that, oh my gosh, Fran Schrag would always ask me, and Adam Nelson, so tell me what you're doing, Sarah, for your doctoral studies. In a nutshell, the foundation of my research is contributing to theorizing policy enactment. What is policy enactment? It's the process by which social actors interpret policy and policy problems, I would say, and then translate that interpretation into everyday practice, oftentimes in school communities, but also far beyond the school wall and far beyond the school day in the case of teachers. So central questions in order to try and do that work have been, how do policies and politics work? And I hope what I've explained so far begins to show you how that matters and how that question evolves into the stories I've been telling. But I don't stop just there because I do understand that within policies and politics are always intersectional dynamics that involve power. And so I also try to answer that first question through a gender intersectional lens that's context specific. And lastly, and this is really something that I'm trying to work on a lot more in my writing and also trying to carve out more time in my academic work, how and why do policy processes change? And how can I, as I am right now, come as I may, be a part of that change? The central foci of my research over the whole course of my career have been school food, which is what I foreground now, teachers' work for a majority of it. And I really began by being very curious about curriculum and about textbooks and specifically gender representations in social studies curriculum and textbooks. The contexts I've looked at are Argentina, this so-called global thing, the context of COVID, and I do work comparatively as well, both intra-national, but also comparing across national cases. But where the heck did those questions and foci come from? And where did the context come from too? Well, going back to what I said earlier, they really came from what I care about and my concern for caring for women and for children and for public education more broadly. And this is an origin story that has to do with why policy enactment in the first place as a part of my academic career, the foundation for it, really. So before I came to EPS, I was actually the assistant to the president of an organization, a national organization in Washington, D.C., called NARAL. It's now Pro-Choice America. And while I was there, I was responsible for working with the White House, working with Congress, working with the Supreme Court on crafting laws and protecting laws to support the full range of reproductive health for women and their families in the United States. And while I was doing that work, which was very meaningful and so interesting, and you felt so powerful, and I actually owned a navy blue suit, which I definitely don't own right now, and even a pair of pumps, which I definitely don't own right now. While I was there, though, over and over again, we were talking about women. Over and over again, we were talking about communities and their access to healthcare, to a full range of healthcare options. And yet I really didn't have an idea of what that felt like. And so I went 2 blocks away from the national office and I picked up a part-time gig and I worked as an abortion counselor for Planned Parenthood. And I did that because I needed to viscerally feel and understand what it means for a woman, for a family, for a couple to try and access this reproductive health care that I was working with the White House and Congress to write and to protect. So that really is where this back and forth, zooming in and zooming out, really became embedded in who I am as an academic. It was that experience and understanding the way policy works, but understanding, perhaps to me, I just needed to know, like on the ground, like what this meant for actual real life people, not just stories that I was reading. And so I cared about that and I did that work. Interestingly, too, before I move on, it's been humbling the last 5-ish years because my daughters are Argentinian and US citizens. And in their very short lifetimes already, they've seen their right to a full range of reproductive health care become legal in Argentina and celebrate that with their cousins and with their aunts who were a part of the green movement in the country. And then they come back to the United States and that has changed dramatically. Not so much in New York where we all live, but it was definitely significant to them as they continue to grow and live, if they live in the United States. My own education was also, to bring this back into education and education policy. So my own education was also a catalyst for my concern with policy engagement, as well as the education that my children were receiving. And here I just I have a little funny. I remember, I was a grad student. I had 1 kid when I started. I had 2 kids when I graduated. I now have 3. But while I was there, I had Gloria Ladson-Billings as a mentor, as part of the Spencer Wisconsin Foundation, whatever the full name of it is. But I remember her at one point going, "I learned the hard way. Don't get involved in your kid's school on issues of public policy or education policy." And I mean, I was like, "Oh, she didn't say that." And she said she had learned, she said, but you can learn on your own, learn by practice and learn by doing. Julia Koza also said this as well. I've definitely learned how much to push in my children's schools, and how to play those identities of being a mother scholar. But my own education, my kids' education, I guess I could summarize as being driven by three really big questions. And I think we can switch the slide. I'm not really sure, but let's give it a go. Yeah, so cool. Why do I know nothing about the world, about US neighbors in Latin America, and about the US empire and imperialism? I did an undergraduate degree in history and political science. It was really political philosophy, not political science and gaming, et cetera. I also was a certified teacher in New York State for social studies. And I arrived in my classroom for my student teaching, and the world was in my classroom. But that world I knew nothing about. I knew absolutely nothing about. And so shame on me, because I guess I wasn't curious enough or didn't make the time to learn more about that world. But also shame on the education system that prepared me to be a school teacher who's going to teach social studies, world history, and really didn't know it. Second question, why does the political economy continue to prioritize and value the productive economy, but not the social and reproductive economy on which it depends? And then the final question that drives my own policy engagement and concern for public policy around education is this third one, and change the slide. How come in the United States, civic engagement is abysmal, as well as civic knowledge, how to engage in and with the public and with public institutions that are governing us, the public, we the public? And one example from which that just bubbled up over and over again has led me to kind of really think about the need for a policy education just for the general public, not just for us who are becoming public or public policy scholars and academics, or policy wonks, policy analysts in those governing institutions. But when I was a parent leader in Buffalo Public Schools, pushing the district to maintain teacher staffing levels, over and over again when we were going through like how we were going to mobilize and let our elected officials on the Board of Education know about our opinions so that they wouldn't vote against this, against cutting, so they would not vote to cut teacher staffing. They would say to me, like, I can't call an elected official. I'm going to get in trouble. They're going to arrest me. I can't go to a Board of Education. I'm not allowed. These were the types of things that I was told, oftentimes by college educated people. So, even though Buffalo is not as highly, doesn't have this like uber credentialed population like Madison does, it was the college educated people, white collar and white, people who were saying that about public policy. This lack of a policy education, let's call it a lack of policy education, I've realized it really stymies change in Buffalo. And something that's in the back of my mind that I wanted to share out here. But providing care and even caring about, and you can fill in the blank, can be draining. And then there are, of course, the legacies of oppression that are differentially carried in our bodies. So all this work about policy engagement and policy protagonism, like, let's be real, parents are tired. They are already busy and overprogrammed their kids, but that's another talk. But this is tiring. This is real work. This is emotional labor. So, and for me as well, even if it is part of my job. So I continue to learn and practice and undo learned practices to care for myself as an academic. Sometimes that entails being a policy protagonist. Other times it entails reflecting on the way that I organize my work into my life. Asking myself, for example, slide, let's hope the picture comes up. Am I living to work, or am I working to live? Next slide. So I'm wrapping up here. Food is always central to me, though. especially when I'm working to live. Um, Growing it, purchasing it from farmers who I develop relationships, eating with family, friends, and community, asking my kids about food at school. And then this is my last slide. So during this talk, I tried to make a shift. I began by saying, like, I was so stuck on preparing this talk because I kept asking the question that I couldn't answer. What do I have to say to EPSers? When in reality, what I often turn to and what I say to my own doc students regularly is a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. No comments on him, but what he said that I've tweaked here is speak because you have something to say, not because you want to say something. So, in sum, my EPS education actually it kind of gave me the foundation. It gave me it helped. It was a place where I thrived. I know that's not the case for everyone, but I did thrive. And it was the first real intellectual community that I developed, and I still have. Um, and it gave me the tools to speak because I have something to say, and specifically because I have something to say about the need to care and need to care for and about policy protagonism as part of our work as education policy researchers. So I came up with these questions for you to take away with you. Take it or leave it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robert. I know I learned, it's okay. I know I learned a lot from your talk. We do have a few minutes left here for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please just feel free to unmute and ask it or type one into the chat. I do see we have one here from Yelena. Could you say more about why you are focusing on policy protagonism and not policy advocacy or policy activism? What theoretical and practical affordances does that give you? And what are the intellectual and theoretical roots of this concept?
I wish I had a really elaborate response to that. And I don't for right here, right now. There was something about advocacy that didn't seem sufficient for what I was seeing from the teachers. So I did kind of push that aside. The theoretical roots are really feminist roots. It really because a lot of these the four facets to me actually emerged from my understanding of feminist consciousness building, doing so in community and collectively. So if I had to say there were like particular roots, implicitly that's what I would say are the roots of that. As far as the terminology goes, I don't know why advocacy never seems sufficient. It didn't seem powerful enough for what I saw different actors, stakeholders doing on the ground. Yeah, that's my short answer. But you should email me and I'll give you a longer answer. I also want to say I'm really embarrassed. I practiced this multiple times and I always came out at 30 minutes. So sorry.
No worries. I have kind of a follow-up question, which is similarly about policy protagonism. So particularly thinking about this in conversation with desire-based research and Eve Tuck's work on that. And I'm wondering what role you see for critique and particularly thinking about teachers, when they're saying or doing things that are maybe less caring or less equitable.
Yeah, I actually just worked on this. I've been sussing out a conceptual framework for care in teaching work with two scholars, one who works for the New York City School Department and is the leads a group that mentors Black women teachers within the district, and another who works specifically with trans teachers and LGBTQ teachers. And what we were trying to do is elevate the lessons about the need to understand the complexity of care, and that not all teachers have the capacity to care in the way that our students need them to, and that can sometimes be harmful, and not necessarily be caring or create a careful institution for all families in our schools. So, and I would say, and also, as for the minoritized or smaller populations, on the underrepresented populations of teachers in our schools, they aren't very cared for either by public school systems around the United States or in the context of Eve Tuck's work in Canada. So when I use care, you got to be careful, because how care is received is not the intent. How care is received by students, for example, from a teacher, isn't always the care that a student or their family wants, and vice versa. It's not always the way that teachers wish to be cared for or be a part of, engage in a relationship with their school communities. I don't know if that answers the question, Abby, but I think that it's about complicating care and its use when we're thinking about and we're looking at how teachers are engaging with their students and families, and understanding it's you provide care and it's also received. And so you have to look at, again, shifting back and forth and understanding that there's going to be differences in terms of how that care is defined, and whether it's wanted in the first place. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Robert. Unfortunately, we are at time, but we really appreciate your talk. Yeah, as I said, I know I learned a lot from it, and I can see in the comments that folks are getting a lot out of it too. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.